Oh, hi to anyone who's watching. My name is Zoë Barrett-Wood, and I am the current intern with CCECM. And I'm very excited to be interviewing you both, Marc and Colm, today about your book, which I have right beside me, was sent in the mail. So nice. Um, yeah, it was such a fascinating read. And of course, I already knew a little bit about ODR beforehand from taking the mediation training that Colm was part of with Richard Moore. Um, but I learned a lot from this book. So we're just going to have a bit of a chat about it.
Well,
Sounds
thanks for
good.
having us. Yeah,
Do you two want to introduce yourself, or do you want to do you want me to jump into the questions?
I think the questions are good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so to begin with, just in general, I mean, you've both been doing this for a long time. I would have thought, had I not known you two, that online dispute resolution came about during the pandemic as a response to the limitations of the pandemic. But of course, I learned from you that it's been around much, much longer than that. Um, so you've both been working in the field for a while. What was the impetus to write a book about it? Where did the idea for the book come from?
Well, to give credit where it's due, it was Mark's idea. We've both chatted over the years, and we've both written stuff over the years, and we have our ODR course through CCECM. And I think one day Mark just asked me if I still had the paper I wrote back in 2003 somewhere. And that paper became a chapter in an ADR practice manual. But as it happened, I did have it. And so I sent it to Mark, and then he told me what we were going to do, which was to put together, our writings and kind of bookmark them by, the stuff I did 20 years ago and stuff he did a couple of years ago, and then around it, plug in articles and and just go with it and see where it went. So as I say, Mark's idea, collaborative in terms of putting material together, and yeah. So Mark.
Well, as you say, so a lot of people did think with the pandemic hitting around March 2020 that online dispute resolution was relatively new. And around that time, there were a lot of people in the field who were moving online for the first time after either never thinking they ever would or never taking the concept seriously, not thinking it would ever really apply to them, which I felt for Colm and I provided a very unique opportunity because here we had been studying, researching, promoting it for years, recognizing that these concepts go back to the 90s. And so many people were trying to catch up and become familiar and really scramble to get their practices online because they had no other way to continue on. So it was just such a unique time. And as some of the restrictions started to ease and people started to wonder whether or not they should go back in person when various decisions were coming from the courts around how that was going to go, it just seemed like a really interesting time for us to take a look back at what we had done all those years before, to take a look at what we're dealing with in the current times, and also to speculate a little bit about the future. I felt that we were in a unique position to be able to draw on those three perspectives. And it was just really an interesting time to reflect back and look at it. So we took the opportunity to do that.
So great. Well, okay, so that connects to the title of the book. ODR, yesterday, today, tomorrow. I guess you're speaking a bit to that now in terms of the meaning of that, but is there anything else you want to share about why you chose that title?
The original title was ODR Then Now Forever. But then now forever is a catchphrase that's used in professional wrestling that World Wrestling Entertainment has a
Okay.
trademark on. So we decided that we probably shouldn't interfere with their trademark. It's not a good idea for mediators to get into an adversarial process with a bunch of wrestlers. So we decided to switch it instead to yesterday, today, tomorrow. Same kind of concept. And it's actually a term I used since I was a kid for whatever reason and kind of looking at different things. So it just seemed like it was a safer and more natural fit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and it also encapsulates what we're trying to do as well. I mean, as Mark said, what we want to do is put out there that, this isn't new. And it's kind of surprising that you have to do that because we're all so familiar with technology today. And yet when, COVID hit, it was, oh my God, what are we going to do? And it struck both of us that one of the problems was, you know, mediators are, and arbitrators are a wee bit different. They've done online stuff for a long time, particularly international. But mediators and lawyers hadn't really got their head around what was going to happen. And that became really evident when everybody jumped on Zoom. And, you know, then you probably remember one day Zoom was the greatest thing in the world. And the next thing it was the most dangerously, no privacy, no confidentiality stuff. And, you know, I ran a couple of webinars for the ADR Institute of Canada on using Zoom. And the reason I did that was because it became really clear that one of the big problems was we're so used to taking a phone out of a box and turning it on, taking the computer off and turning it on. And people forgot about things like settings. And that becomes very important from what we do, right? We want some level of it. And we also, Mark and I, help draft some guidelines for the use of technology for the ADR Institute of Ontario as well. So it was just a good opportunity to help our colleagues move forward and at the same time make sure they did it more or less okay. And that's the key thing, you know, more or less good enough. That's what we were looking for then. And I think both of us did a lot of work to get us there. And then Mark's idea came up.
One of the, I guess, pet peeves that I had around that time was, and I can understand why, but so many people who were rushing to go online were trying to replicate in-person processes online instead of recognizing that, like, one, it's never going to be the same. You may be able to have some things that are similar, but if the three of us were having a meeting in person, it would be different. No matter how much we try to have the same type of dynamics, it would be different. And instead of focusing on trying to replicate in person online, I've always thought that online presents an opportunity to overcome some of the deficiencies of in-person processes, some of the systemic biases and some of the challenges around access to justice and those types of things. So I thought it was a real missed opportunity if we just tried to mimic what we do in person online as though in person is the absolute best and belongs on this pedestal. There are deficiencies in traditional processes that there are opportunities to overcome. And I thought it was an important message to include in the book to get people thinking, so they don't just think that all you have to do to mediate online is get a Zoom account.
Well, as you can see, Mark's really thought about this. My line's very simple. It's not the same, it's similar. And you need to know the difference. And so really what we were saying to people, I suppose, is along with the skills that you have as an ADR practitioner, you really need a wee bit of tech confidence as well. Not a huge amount. You don't have to program and stuff, but you need to have an idea and make sure it worked for our clients. And I mean, we were all in the same boat in many ways. And what's really surprising is how quickly people adapt it. And yeah, I think there are things we can do online you can't in person. Apart from the very practical side of it, which is, you know, cost saving, efficiency, time, easier to schedule, all kinds of stuff like that. That all kind of come out when you start walking down that path. So, but we wanted people to see it as almost a continuum. The way we see in CCM, which I suppose we should explain, the kind of idea of a spectrum of processes. Well, ODR in many ways is a spectrum as well. And this was a time of opportunity and change, and to me, a transition. And so that's part of it. And so we worked through the book and did many versions of it. And again, Mark did most of the work. I got to give him that too. And we managed to pull it together. And there were some interesting times doing it. I mean, one of the things, and you know, you've looked at it, is we both have quite different styles in writing as well. And so we dithered over, should we kind of make the style like one? How about our differences in footnoting even? And then we decided, no, let's reinforce the fact that this has been around and we won't change anything. We'll edit a little bit where we have to. And that was fun. It really was fun, trying to come up with that and at the same time not treading each other's toes. So.
I think it makes for a dynamic read, really. Like the switching back and forth between perspectives. I like it. I think it's great.
Thank you.
Thanks. For me, it wasn't just the differences between Colm's writing style and mine. It's how my own has changed over the years. Looking back at stuff that I wrote 15 years ago, I wrote differently than I do now. It's kind of neat. And I've had a few people kind of comment that something that they enjoyed as a side part of checking out the book is just seeing how my writing style changed and seeing how that moved along with the experience and the thoughts around these online processes.
Yeah, where mine, as I get older, just regresses. So I mean, it's.
I don't know about that, but that's another piece that I'd love to hear about is the reception for the book so far. How's it been received? What have you heard back from folks?
In my world, people have been pretty excited. We did a workshop around the book for the ADR Institute of Ontario earlier this year that had a bigger turnout than they had expected, and the administrators were very excited about it. The participants were very enthusiastic. They were quoting certain pages and like during the workshop, so they clearly had done their homework. I've had a number of people just say that they thought that it was something that was really interesting in the time that we released it, in terms of where we are with online processes now, and how some of the challenges that we expressed existed in the early 2000s are again issues that are still present, although a little bit different, but the same underlying types of considerations today. So I think we gave people something to think about. Of course, they have to say nice things to us though when they're saying it. So try to look online, and haven't seen any negative posts just yet. So hasn't been too bad. How about you, Colm?
Yeah, I mean, we've had one review by Mike Ertl, who's a mediator arbitrator and really, really good writer in Toronto. And he was very positive. He mentioned something that's pretty obvious, is that because we were putting things together, there's some repetition. But it, kind of got to where we wanted to. And then we did ICODR, which is the International Council on Online Dispute Resolution. We did a podcast with them. And then, we're doing this. Marc set up Jade, the group, to have a chat with them. And in February, we're going to be presenting about the book and talking about the book with the mediate.com in the US. They have a book club, Great Reads, they call it. Well, I wouldn't go that far for us, but it's a good enough read. And we're going to do that. And that's really important because, the foreword by Colin Rule, who I've known with him, was actually on the advisory board of one of the companies he ran. The foreword, I think adds, a lot of validity to it because he's very well known. And so, that was a help. But I think the book club one will be good because generally speaking, I've gone to a number of them, and generally speaking, the people who attend have a great deal of experience and, think about what they're saying and what they're doing. So it'll either be fantastic or terrifying, one or the other.
Or both.
or both.
Terrifyingly fantastic.
Yeah, good. I like that.
One of the things that I didn't realize when we were putting it together is shortly after it was released was that it's the first book out of Canada on online dispute resolution. Now, there have been some books, like Richard Susskind released a book in 2019 called Online Courts in the Future of Justice. He's based out of the UK. And in that book, he credits Canada as being amongst the world leaders in online dispute resolution. He talks about the Civil Resolution Tribunal out of British Columbia, which was online. But there hadn't been a collection or anything from Canadian authors that had really talked about this. And we have a number of examples around the country of administrative tribunals, of technology being put to use, and those sorts of things. So I was surprised that we were the first, but there has been a lot of enthusiasm about that as well. And one thing that's been really cool with this is being able to go, like the ICODR podcast we did with the fellow who's hosting it out of New Zealand. The mediate.com stuff is going to be down in the US. We did a keynote for International Mediation Awareness Week representing the Americas. It was just really nice to be able to take this Canadian perspective and share it with others who have similar types of challenges, but haven't heard as much as they perhaps should have around what's been happening up here.
Is there something specific to the Canadian context for this, would you say? Like what's going on here that you can share with others?
Marc, do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, what we found so far in terms of different markets internationally, view Canada as being a land of great diversity. So we get a lot of questions around some of the cross-cultural challenges, so to speak, around doing these processes online, where I guess other regions that don't have as much diversity amongst their populations view the people that would come together to address a conflict online as having similar cultural traits and understandings. And where they see us coming into the mix is dealing with people with a wide spectrum of commands of language, of preferences and how to communicate, of belief systems, of mannerisms and what they mean, and those sorts of things. So we tend to get a lot of questions and a lot of interest around how we work with a diverse group of people in these online systems. And that extends to also those who are not necessarily represented in these systems with legal representatives as well.
Yeah, yeah, and that connects to one of the sections of the book that I'd love to ask you more about if we have time. But I'd love to hear a bit maybe about each section of the book. I'd love to hear about the systemic bias section, which I found really interesting. But I know you sort of it's divided into this past, present, future, and I was wondering if you wanted to speak a bit to each of those sections to give folks a sense of what they can expect.
Before we go there, let me just throw in a little bit about the Canadian situation.
Oh, please, yeah.
Okay. I mean, we have at the moment 2 tribunals. Excuse me a moment. You might want to edit that out. We have 2 tribunals, the Civil Resolution Tribunal in British Columbia, and it essentially has now replaced Small Claims Court. And we have the Condominium Authority Tribunal, Ontario, which is the first fully online tribunal. And what's kind of unique about these tribunals, and I think really unique here at the moment and making Canada leader, is the fact that these are designed for the end user. They're designed for the people who have the disputes, not for the professionals who assist them, which the traditional court system is. And that's a huge change. And that's why, and the technology gives greater access. But we can go back before that. British Columbia has had a distant mediation program going on since, I don't know, 2010 maybe, with guidelines. And they also, Legal Aid BC did a fair amount of work using technology. They used the Modria technology from the US. So, I mean, we've had that. And you know, there's studies, center dealing with artificial intelligence and dispute resolution at Queen's University Law School and engineering. It's funny, ADR, not a core subject in law school, and it's often hard to get full-time professors to teach it, so it's usually adjunct to teach it. However, when you put in technology, everybody wants to teach it, so it works well. And there's that. There's Cyber Justice Lab in Montreal. So there's a lot going on and has been for a while. And I think we don't trumpet that enough. You know, we're in everyone's shadow, and in fact, we're not. And I wrote a review of a book on, you know, comparing different dispute resolution systems and behaviors in the world, a comparative one. And my main comment was, Canada's missing from this. You know, in fact, the editor got back to me and said, yeah, I agree, kind of sorry about that. But I think it's a good opportunity for us to push forward something different. And Canada has a history of, you know, being an innovator in technology, not carrying it to the next level, but being the innovator. We want to carry it to the next level as well.
Yeah, be the idea person, but then also the one who carries that forward. That's great. Yeah, okay, so then do you want to speak a bit to, I'd love to hear a bit about how you decided to divide it up this way and what the sections, kind of the main takeaways for you from each section maybe, or what you hope folks would take away from each of those sections?
For me, the past section is really trying to highlight just how this is not new. In the academic world, when I was doing my master's, as a Colm, I did some research about ODR in a number of my courses. And some people thought, oh, you're not going to find very much. There hasn't been a lot of research done. This is all relatively new, but it's not. It's been around since the mid-90s. In fact, they've categorized the different generations of research in ODR by decade. We're now in the 4th generation of academic research on ODR. There was the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and now the 2020s. There's a lot of reports, there's a lot of analysis, there's a lot of experiments and studies out there that capture a lot of the historical concerns around, oh, does everybody have access to a computer? And online exchanges are going to be cold and impersonal. These are not new criticisms or concerns. They've been around for a really, really long time. So I think it's important for people to recognize that, particularly those who just kind of have knee-jerk reactions and assume superficially that some of their concerns are going to make it something that's not going to work. Because in fact, there has been a lot of consideration given and money invested and minds put towards how to overcome some of those concerns and to analyze them. So I think that's really important. It was one of the things that came out in Mike Laurel's book review, is just how he found it was interesting that some of the issues that people are thinking about now have existed in different ways in the past. So I think that's really important to know as you're getting involved, because if you do have hesitations, there's no shortage of resources available to help you grapple with how you're going to deal with those hesitations.
Yeah, and a lot of the resources are kind of worldwide. There is a worldwide ODR community that's separate from kind of the business tech community that designed the first systems, like Colm designed the eBay dispute resolution mechanism. And, so they were, as e-commerce started, we needed a way to deal with disputes. And so technology, because they were low value. And where do you sue somebody if you live in Toronto and you're buying something from somebody in Singapore? I mean, and it's not worthwhile. So they needed to set up their own kind of systems. And in fact, there's an article floating around called eBay Law. And what it's suggesting is, it is a legal system. And if you want to go and work with eBay, you have to be in their legal system, which is kind of like how arbitration originated in medieval trading agreements and stuff. So there's a lot of that. And we move from that into a lot of the considerations that Marc has studied about bias, where we're going, what's the best practices, ethics. Are there different standards? How do we develop standards in something that's worldwide? And there have been some great projects in the UK and in the Netherlands. They had an operating family law one that was very, very successful. But unfortunately, they didn't renew the funding, which I really don't understand. But there's a lot of that in Australia. There's stuff going on, New Zealand. I mean, mostly common law countries, but still across the world. And, that's kind of where we are today. And I think we wanted to, as I said, situate Canada in that. Also because we have a sense, I think, of, where we are today is a transition stage. And so looking at the future is, which path do we want to go down? Because there's lots of different paths. The obvious one is using AI. And quite frankly, if everybody who talked about AI actually used it, we'd be miles ahead. I mean, there's lots written, not much going on in the dispute resolution work, but that's where the project at Queen's comes in. They have, I believe it's an insurance company giving them data. So they'll have enough data to actually, do predictive analysis and stuff like that. So there's this kind of mechanical approach, and what happens to us as mediators and arbitrators and lawyers if we have intelligent machines that learn. We see that in medicine, where a lot of, for example, reports are electronic now, scans, and they can be machine read, in fact, at a higher accuracy, which is kind of frightening, but is there. So law and dispute resolution was kind of out of step. It was still pretty much the way it's always been. And, before the pandemic, a well-known mediator in Toronto had decided for insurance claims, there's actually, programs that will do the whole thing. So they're basically blind bidding. You put in 3 numbers, the other side puts in 3 numbers. If they cross, you have a deal. Very efficient. Yeah, not great maybe from a human point of view, but very efficient. So he offered the use of that platform at no cost to 100 lawyers and had 0 uptake. And the reason he had 0 uptake was because we don't have to do it. Why would we do something we don't have to do it? But that all changed with the pandemic. And so the real question, I think, is where are we going to go? And so we were just speculating a wee bit about that. There's no doubt that the future of the legal system in terms of access to justice is in tribunals, and tribunals that are designed for the end user, the real user. So that in itself is a huge change. Where's that going to go? What's going to happen with the courts? And then outside the courts, what we do. Are we going to have robo-mediator one day, or robo-arbitrator? Maybe, maybe not. So, Mark?
Well, it was also just such an interesting time kind of moving to the present and thinking about these concepts. In the book, there's a transcript in one chapter from a podcast that Colm and I recorded back in 2015 about ODR. And one of the questions I asked him has stuck with me to this day, where it was essentially saying, like, look, we have the technology to do this. Why aren't we? Like, is there anything that's stopping somebody that has a dispute right now and needs to mediate it in 2015 from doing it online? And Colm said, there's nothing that prevents them. They have the option, but what's lacking is the legitimacy. And what's happened since that podcast was recorded in 2015 is we've had two areas where we've gotten legitimacy. The first is the inclusion of online processes into the public justice system. As Colm mentioned, the administrative tribunals. More people in this country are going to experience an administrative tribunal than are going to experience firsthand the Supreme Court of Canada. So the concept of small claims court and those types of things getting incorporated into online processes, more people are going to become familiar with them and see the online process as a natural way to go about addressing your dispute. The second is just people have had to try it because they were forced into it. I've kind of dubbed it the great acceleration, because we always knew that we were going to get to this point of the average person being familiar with a video meeting and the concepts of mediating and arbitrating online, but it was accelerated because of the pandemic, when there was no other way, when courts were closed, where in-person gatherings weren't possible, whether it was a video conference to stay in touch with family members overseas or just being able to get your work done for the day. We have experienced it and we've gotten that additional familiarity with it. You know, there are times where, like I say, I almost feel like I'm in a John Hughes movie, because for years I wasn't very popular in some of the things that I would say, and then all of a sudden I became very popular. Both Colm and I have not had many fans at certain conferences we went to over the years. I remember one in 2019 for the Family Dispute Resolution Institute of Ontario, when I was asked point blank at the beginning of a panel session, you know, Mark, why do you think that the family law field hasn't embraced online dispute resolution? And my answer was, because of all of you in the audience, like all of you successful practitioners who have gotten used to these in-person ways of doing things, who've had success and feel like you're good at doing these online in-person processes. Why would you switch to something you don't know, to something new, especially if your experience gives you a perceived advantage over others who are opposing you, who are new to this, right? Like there wasn't the motivation to do it. But it got to a point where it wasn't a choice anymore. So I think those two avenues really brought us forward when it comes to online dispute processes. And so it was just really a fascinating time to kind of look at where we are right now and where all this is going. So, for example, one of the interesting debates that I found has come up recently is the notion of, should the cost of in-person processes, like an in-person mediation, increase post-pandemic? Because everybody's capable, for the most part, unless there's some good extenuating circumstance, to be able to do it online, saving the travel time, saving the environmental harm, all those types of things. If it's going to take more time of the mediator to facilitate an in-person process, shouldn't you pay more if you require more time of the mediator, which has become an interesting discussion that hadn't really been considered seriously years before?
It's interesting what Mark says about the Family Dispute Resolution Institute and what he said that perhaps didn't go over brilliantly, although it may have. People think about it. The year before, I'd spoken on online dispute resolution at the same conference, and the room divided, you know, between people who thought, oh, this is younger people generally, it's a good idea, and people my age were going, oh my God, I don't want to do that. And the question I raised, which people weren't thrilled with, was, if we have online dispute resolution and if we are using technology as a tool, how do you demonstrate value? Why should people come to you? And that's not something we like to think about. Family is the obvious area. I mean, that's why I started my research, because I wanted to provide a safe space for domestic violence type cases and also distance cases. It seemed absurd to me that if you lived in Vancouver and your kids were in Toronto, you would have to come to Toronto for any court proceedings, even if it was just where they're spending holidays. You know, it really didn't need physical presence. So that was where my initial kind of ideas were coming. I always liked technology, but it was just, we can do this. Canada's a huge country, it makes sense. The first time I spoke about it in a conference was in February in Ottawa at Carleton University. And it would be fair to say that my reception from the family law practitioners there was chillier than it was outside, and that was February. So it just didn't go very well. And then it ebbed and flowed. But there's lots of things, but that is an issue. How do we add value? And what Marc said is value. If I'm going to be there, I'm going to, you know, there's extra costs. There's costs for facilities. There's all kinds of different issues that come out from a practice management point of view and a marketing point of view, as much as a technology point of view. So, yeah.
I think it's fascinating to think about, yeah, what is different about the online dispute resolution process? What are these advantages in addition to the obvious ones, like you mentioned, Colm, earlier, like this speed and accessibility and all that. But even the things you're mentioning now of the safety piece, you know, if it's related to domestic violence or the stuff around systemic bias, those are the pieces when I look at all the questions that I wrote, which I have too many to ask you during this time frame, but a lot of them related to that, because I think that is what's so exciting. And I think when I imagine these rooms full of people who are pushing back, I imagine it's because of what you're saying. It's just like, well, it won't be this, we can never replicate the in-person experience. And like you said earlier, Marc, no, we can't. And so viewing this as a completely different thing and lifting it up on its own pedestal of what does it offer. So I don't know if you've already been speaking to some of this, but I would love to hear from both of you maybe some of the pieces that are maybe the lesser known kind of, you know, hidden gems of online dispute resolution, what it offers that is so different from an in-person experience.
From my perspective, one of the biggest challenges, sometimes it's helpful, but one of the biggest challenges with in-person processes is everybody travels to come together for a set period of time, and that's it. And I've had so many mediations where in the course of a discussion, we realize that, oh, there's a piece of information that's missing. Or, oh, here's an option, but we're not sure how realistic it is because we need to do some research into it. What's really nice about the online is the ability to break up a process into a series of smaller events to allow there to be breaks. Not only is it helpful for gathering additional information, I find it's helpful for people who aren't used to participating in these processes. A self-represented person giving them time to be able to, in between process events, do some research, check in for some legal advice if they choose to. Some of that flexibility, I think, makes it a lot easier for people to participate. And I don't think that's always appreciated enough, especially when we just try to move the in-person process online. So just book it in a slot of set number of hours and be done with it.
Yeah, and scheduling is a big plus. There's also one of the things that I was really glad to see was that there's always been a feeling that older people don't like to use technology. And there's a certain truth in that. But we found out that, yeah, people were quite happy to use technology at any age. If you were older, it was because they were speaking to their kids or grandkids on video during COVID. And so it shifted a lot. It was going that way, but it shifted. And, you know, there's also the safety stuff. Marc and I, you know, as well as collaborating, more or less compete a wee bit in a similar market. But, you know, I had a safety one. It's not family law, a neighbor dispute, that I would not have brought them together. Even though I've been doing this a long time, there was police involvement, allegations, racism, violence. It was very nasty. And I could bring them together this way, not easily, but without being fearful that it was going to explode, which I think it would have. So, you know, the other thing that's surprising, it's like the unintended consequences are that I can't think of one case I've done that would have a different outcome if I'd done it in person. which really surprises me. And going back to Mark's comments, that's my pet peeve, is not being prepared for mediation. It's one of the reasons I like MedR, because the mediation phase in it, people are prepared because they might go to arbitration if I'm writing an article about that, because it is something that, but if you can break, and in one that we had, one of the participants was 94, which is even older than me. And so we had to figure it out. Her lawyer didn't want her to do it online. Oh, no, 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 no. And she was saying, no, I speak to my grandkids, great grandkids, I'll do it. But we broke up the time. So instead of doing a half day, we did a couple of 2-hour sessions. Doing that in person would be very expensive and very difficult to schedule. Doing it through video made it very easy. Then there's, what about people? Are they more comfortable being in their homes or in their offices? You know, does that help the process? Does it add different complexities to it, as in who's in the room? And things like that, that I think we thought about them, but now we're seeing what's happening with them. And it really is an interesting time. Marc has done a lot of work on self-representation issues. And of course, there's many ways into the system if you're using technology, phone, text, and video. We all think of video, but you know, phone mediation was used by the Financial Services Commission Ontario for many years, and very, very successfully. So what we're doing is trying to bring stuff together so that people can pick the tools that are best for the job, instead of taking a hammer to everything because it looks like a nail.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Go ahead, Mark.
So just one piece that we need to make sure that we keep in mind is that it's not all sunshine and roses. Like there are, every rose has its thorn, as the song goes, right? Like there are some negative sides and some drawbacks for online systems that we can't take for granted. So for example, I think it's really interesting that in both Ontario and in British Columbia, the first types of disputes that went online at administrative tribunals were condominium conflicts, because historically ODR originated because people were doing business an ocean apart. And it didn't make sense to spend 5 figures on legal fees when you're arguing over $100 transaction through eBay. But in these condominium disputes, often people are in community with one another. It's entirely possible that you could have an online mediation session with people who get quite angry, and then 5 minutes after the session ends, they find themselves in an elevator with one another. So it's important that we recognize that ODR doesn't exist in a vacuum, that some of the screenings and the safe measures that we put in place are still required online. We can't just imagine that they disappear and they aren't a factor anymore because we're going online, because we all exist more than just online. That's an important aspect. The other is that while we can overcome certain traditional biases and hurdles that present themselves in person, we always risk introducing new ones with the online dynamic. So consider you have two parties, one that has a seamless internet connection, one has a not so great internet connection, and they can't participate in quite the same way because one person keeps cutting out. What type of power imbalance does that potentially display that you'd never really have the same type of way in person? So I think we need to keep our eyes open to that as well, that while it does help overcome and get over some of the reasons why we shouldn't have in-person processes on a pedestal, there are still some challenges. No one system is going to be perfect, and we have to keep our eyes open and be able to adjust as needed for those.
Which brings up the topic of system design. You have a lot more scope for system design if you can combine processes and technologies. And it's not an either or. You don't have to be completely online or completely in person. We can have hybrid processes where part of it's done online, part of it's done in person, but you can design it. And you know that from an ADR practitioner perspective, design is very interesting. And so we've gone from, oh, we're going to mediate, to, okay, what kind of mediation? And what do we have to do? And you know how we're going to structure it and what the process is. And I think people are more willing to discuss that because they're still not that completely comfortable with technology. And because if you try it with other people prior to that, you would get, we're just doing a mediation, as if every mediation is the same, which it's not. And very difficult to have a lot of pre-mediation work. And I know that, for example, with Richard Moore, Richard does a lot of pre-mediation in the work he does. in the work I do, I have or had difficulty in getting counsel, and I usually deal with representative parties, together before the mediation. You know, they're busy. Well, now I can either talk to them before it, or we can log on a little earlier and have a conversation without worrying about someone walking into the room. So there's lots of things there that help with design, and I think help us be more effective in helping people come up with their own solutions, which is what mediation's about. And you can do other kinds of processes as well. In fact, I think you can do virtually any process, but you have to think a wee bit about the design. But that's exciting. That's good
That is
going forward.
exciting.
Hmm.
I'm glad you brought that up because one of the things that I did want to ask you about was to speak a bit from that ODR practitioner perspective of I think it's in chapter 5 that you talk about some of the characteristics of a successful ODR practitioner, and I think you qualify, you know, what success is, like you're saying about helping people reach a resolution, and I was intrigued by some of those characteristics that you mentioned, and was wondering if you could speak a bit to that. Thinking of, you know, people who are watching this and thinking, do I have what it takes to do this? And maybe it's not even all about the technological know-how. A lot of us are comfortable with Zoom now, and you know, we can read your guidelines on you know, the ways to make sure that it's the privacy controls and that kind of thing. But I'd love if you could speak a bit more to, from the practitioner perspective, you know, what it's like to do it this way, and again, from that positive side of things or the challenges. But I know I'll just mention one that you had put in there that I would love to hear more about, because I wasn't sure. You said, I think I'm remembering this correctly, that a characteristic of a successful practitioner in ODR is will be able to interrupt frequently. And I was like, oh, tell me more. I'm so intrigued by that. Because that's such a funny thing on Zoom, the jumping in. But anything you want to speak to about the practitioner perspective, I'd love.
Mark?
Oh, well, I guess from the practitioner perspective, one thing that I really want to let people know about and make sure they're aware is when I started offering online services in 2015, 2016, those who would take me up on it were interested in technology and expected the technology to work flawlessly. And one of the historical criticisms of online systems is the lack of personability, the lack of humanness. They're cold. How many times these days now in this new normal do we have meetings where somebody forgets to take off the mute button, or they have their pet crash? And these things that used to at one point be looked at as being catastrophic for how somebody presents themselves professionally are now just part of our everyday life. And the great thing about that is I think it humanizes these online processes, but it also reduces the pressure for practitioners, because the mediator is not expected to be perfect. You do have to have a base level of technological competence in order to do this work, no question. But you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to exercise it flawlessly. So I think that that aspect is really important. And for me, on the interrupting piece, I think that's something that's really interesting. Pauses and time are very different in online exchanges than in person, but there's a little bit more we can get away with online that in person, because of social etiquette, it's a little bit harder to do. For example, I'm often in the course of a mediation online, if I'm in caucus, for example, sending a text message to the parties in the other room. If I did that in person, it would come off as very rude, but there's ways to be able to do it in this type of atmosphere that's not going to be so rude and come off the wrong way. So I think it's leveraging some of those. I do find I'm more controlling with online processes, more directive in terms of what I want people to do. So I think that's part of the interruption piece, just trying to get right to the point and focus people. What do you do, Colm?
Well, I mean, I look on, you know, tech problems as being the equivalent of getting stuck in traffic, driving somewhere. You can adjust to it. And I agree. I think it has helped. At the beginning, people were really concerned. You know, everybody flopped on privacy and confidentiality and stuff. And a number of times when someone would bring that up, I would just ask them if they used email. And they would say, oh, yeah, of course. Do you attach documents? Yeah. Well, what are you talking about security for? Because it's like sending a postcard. But I think a couple of things that really stand out for me is in our traditional mediation training and practice, we have put an awful lot of weight on body language and reading body language. And indeed, that was one of the criticisms of moving online and in the video conferencing. But we've now realized you can actually read as much, if not more, from someone's face and from the involuntary moves around their eyes and their cheeks. And you can get a lot more out of it than I thought any, could. I'd read some research on, there's a lot more now. So that was one, maybe an obstacle, but I think it's been compensated for. And that's because we're much closer than we would be. And so we can judge things just as well. Time is much different. There's no doubt about that. In terms of being tired, remember to blink, stuff like that when you're staring at the screen. And one of the things we did, and because it worked well, I'll say we. If it hadn't worked well, I would have said Mark. Is we decided to, in our ODR course, to change the time for the breakout rooms closing. So we started off at a minute, which most, I think, people use as a standard now. And, minute drags. And then we put it down to half a minute, to 30 seconds. Caught people a wee bit off guard, but again, and then I forget what we dropped it to then, 15 seconds or something. We kept dropping it in half. And it was really an interesting experiment, apart from everything else, and worked quite well because it brought home time in a different way. And so, one of the things I really have to be careful about is I'm so used to being online that I have to really keep in mind to take breaks because people get tired. And, those kind of things. But I think the body language, the idea that it's not flawless, because humans aren't flawless, our systems aren't flawless. I think in many ways that's helped, as Mark said. And certainly, the technology stuff is so much better than we ever expected it would be today. Tomorrow is another issue.
On the tomorrow side, I wasn't going to say too much, and I'm not sure if you saw, Zoe, but at the very end of the book, I thought of it as, how some movies, like Marvel movies, after the credits, there's a scene at the very end. Yeah. That's what I have in the book, is kind of like my post-credit scene of my views of the future. And I wasn't going to put it in, but two things inspired it. The Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial of last year getting so much attention, and specifically Kate Moss as a witness, because Kate Moss provided witness testimony through video while located overseas. And my prediction there was that's how everybody's going to provide witness testimony going forward. Not necessarily always overseas, but from the comfort of where they are, as opposed to having them drag themselves into a courtroom and that sort of thing. It just makes sense to me in terms of efficiencies, because one of the obstacles for access to justice is efficiency. So this is a way that we can deal with that going forward. The other thing was Major League Baseball. I find it very frustrating to watch a game of baseball these days because everybody who's watching knows if a pitch is a ball or a strike, except for the umpire. They show us, with the technology, did the ball go into the strike zone box or didn't it? And then everybody waits to see if the umpire can get it right. And it's just like, it doesn't make sense for it to continue that way when the technology is so readily there. And because baseball is so slow changing, it's an automatic, natural thing to compare to the justice system and law. But if you have the technology, why not embrace it? It only makes sense that in the future, and I believe that they're going to be experimenting with this in the minor leagues fairly soon, equip the decision maker with the technology so they can make sure that they're getting it right. Like, if anything, instead of everybody knowing if it's a ball or a strike except for the umpire, let the umpire know if it's a ball or a strike with the help of the technology to be able to get it right so that we can actually watch and focus on what we're supposed to. So those things kind of inspired me to want to think around the future, and it really delves around efficiency and justice, putting the tools in the right people's hands to get things right.
And that's actually one of my concerns is connecting ADR and justice, because they're two separate things. So court systems are one thing, but if we're doing alternative dispute resolution, online dispute resolution, in many ways the courts are the alternative because most cases settle. But really, when you look at it, but if we're doing it that way, I think we have to be careful. Of course, we want to use technology for access to justice, but I think we have an opportunity here to move ADR further away from the legal system because it's been kind of co-opted into it. And I think the technology helps that as well. If you work with Marc, you know you're going to get pop culture involved in some way. If Hannah Montana, baseball, which by the way, I don't understand at all and never have. And hockey has the technology in it. And even football, which is what you would call soccer. You know, he makes those, and I think they're brilliant because they really bring things into focus. My view of the future is I don't know where it's going, but I do know that, you know, the technology is advancing ferociously quickly. And I think we're going to have to be very careful that we don't see mediation and arbitration. Mediation I'm more concerned with. I prefer being a mediator, although I arbitrate a bit. That we don't see it actually becoming a commodity where an organization with a lot of resources can set up technology and essentially outcompete you. And I think that's something that law firms have to be aware of as well, because we see some changes in that market. So the technology itself, are we moving into an age of everything being done by algorithm? I don't think so. And Marc has you know, looked at the issue of bias in computer programming. And, you know, people will say, oh, well, you know, when we get to the point where the computer can program itself, everything will be great and develop algorithms. Well, it won't, because originally where that came from was a human being, and we all have built-in biases. So I think there's a lot of ethical issues to deal with. You know, who controls the technology? You know, I think both Marc and I made a conscious decision that when we were doing online video, it had to be our system, because we wanted control of any video. We want to control the process. That doesn't mean somebody can't copy it. And Marc also demonstrates that sometimes, which people are stunned at. But, you know, I think there's little things like that we have to think about that we really didn't think about. So, you know, I'll give you an example of that. At the beginning, when people were getting excited about Zoom not being perfect, many insurance companies and governments wanted to use Teams. All right. At the time, Teams wasn't as good because it didn't have breakout rooms. It does now. But the real question then arose is, who's Teams? Is it going to be the insurance company who's a party? You don't want the data there. Is it going to be a law firm? No. It has to be the person who is the neutral, impartial ADR person has to control the technology. And I think we could lose that if we automate it too much. So it's a combination of bringing things in. When we have enough data to do predictive analysis, to do that, they can be used along with it. It can be another hybrid. And I think the CRT in BC is a great example of that. They have what they call a solution explorer at the front end. And as they do more and more cases, they've got more and more data. And it essentially does predictive analysis. You can ask it questions, it'll answer you and point you what part to go down. The same with systems that don't sound very great, but they're very important, is property tax appeals in the US. The company that Colin founded called Modria developed a platform for them that's used widely. And what it does is somebody wants to complain about their property tax going up too much. They go into this process, and before they push the button to start the case, they've gone through a bunch of different gates, and it just before the end, it'll say things like, would you like to see what happened in the last 3 cases with similar facts? Now that's pretty sophisticated, the same as, a lot of big company systems are. I don't see us going there for a while, if ever. I think there'll be a role for humans in dispute resolution, in conflict management, no matter what technology we use. We are storytelling animals, and we like to tell our stories to other people. And I think that will be one of the kind of really strong values that we'll keep even when we're using different technology.
Speaking of being storytelling people, and I know I know we're over our time, but you can just edit this out. But I'm realizing that it would be so nice to hear not just people's feedback about the book, but to get a sense of feedback that you've received from people about being part of an ODR process. I don't know if you can remember any particular examples of feedback that you got from people that was heartening, or a reminder of what an asset this can be.
I have a bit of a favorite one I like to tell in response to Colm saying that hasn't really had any cases that he thinks would have ended up differently if they took place in person and online. So I'm facilitating online mediation through Zoom, and the lawyer for one of the parties I've worked with before, he's a very flamboyant lawyer, definitely has an acting background, and likes to put on a production as part of his whole shtick. And I remember returning from the caucus room with a counteroffer, and I knew he wasn't going to like the counteroffer, and he was really unhappy. And as soon as he heard it, he stood up from his desk and he looked around and he took off his headphones. Then he stopped and he says to me, "Mark, what will happen if I leave right now?" And I said, "Well, they'll probably just think that your internet crapped out." Started shaking his head and he got quite upset and he sat back down and ended up talking to his client, having some time, stayed in the mediation. We ended up getting a deal done. And at the end of it, as everybody's signing off, he says to me, if it was in person, that mediation, I would have left. I would have stormed out at that counteroffer because it was absolutely ridiculous. But I didn't want to risk them thinking that my internet just went out. I couldn't get across online how unhappy I was with the counteroffer. So I had no choice but to stay. It really was a case that if it happened in person, it wouldn't have settled. And it settled because it took place online, because the legal counsel wasn't able to express their not being happy with the counteroffer the way that they would in person. The dynamics of the online system were just different.
Yeah.
Although, to be fair, in person, you can call their bluff in a different way. There's some lawyers who like to say, "I'm leaving at such and such a time." And the first time that ever happened, oh my God, what am I going to do? And it's like, okay, if you want to do that, see ya. But I agree, Mark, it's a great story. The feedback I had is a wee bit different on a particular file. It was in one of those breaks where you could actually be in person, but still, masking and everything else. And there was a dispute that I was asked to mediate. It had 4 parties to it. 3 of them were prepared to do it online and 1 wasn't. So when they got to me, they were saying, "Want to do it in person." So we do it in person. And we're in a huge boardroom. Everyone's masked. They're sitting far apart. People couldn't hear each other. And it really changed the dynamics of it. And then we had people were in breakout rooms and going back and forth was a bit weird. But then something happened, which wouldn't have happened if people hadn't been distant. And I don't think will happen online because you call it. We had the makings of a deal. And then the one party backed out. And they wouldn't have backed out as easily if everyone had been there, even on a screen. But because we were so separated, even when we were there, it was interesting because I had actually had a mediation week before. One of the lawyers on the way out, she said, "We should have done this online." I said, that's what I was trying to get you to do. It would have been different. And I found that very, very interesting because, first of all, I think behavior online is quite different. People may be more relaxed. On the other hand, they may be more angry and more prepared to let it out in a way they wouldn't if you were sitting beside them. Is that good or bad? I don't know. That's one of the questions we kind of have to look at. But I mean, I do stand by, I don't think any of them would have been different. And part of it is what Mark alluded to earlier is you can stop and say, okay, so where is that document? And because unfortunately, because it's kind of rote, as far as many people are concerned, one's the same as the other. We don't have a level of preparation often that, encourages richer settlements. There's a lot of value left behind because, it was settled based on not so accurate information or information that's missing parts that might let you go somewhere else. And if that comes up and you in person and you kind of say, well, maybe we should adjourn and come back, you're getting a lot of pushback. We're here. The fact they didn't bring it's not my fault, et cetera, et cetera. Online, you could say, okay, so, or we'll take a break for an hour while you go get it. And you don't have to scurry back to your office because you're in it. So there's lots of things there that I think can improve mediation. And the feedback I've had, I mean, and Mark, I think it's the same experience. At the beginning, we did a lot of coaching with lawyers in particular and with self-reps, but till they got familiar with the process. And you would set it up and they would willingly do it. And then they got familiar with it and they wouldn't really willingly do it, which was okay. One of the things that came out of that is some lawyers who had held off on moving online were then quite embarrassed to have to say to you, well, I'm not really familiar with this, and ask you to spend time with them. And of course you would, because you want the process to run smoothly. That's probably the one thing we're incredibly concerned about, is running a good process. And I think, as Mark has said, and as I have said, it's doable and it'll continue to be. But we need to continue the conversation. And there are some groups are missing from the conversation. At the beginning, it was driven by people who thought tech was neat. And I was one of them. And I studied computer science. The computer was bigger than my house and the power of a pocket calculator. So, I mean, I kind of find it still, ooh. But now it's been driven by market, by efficiencies, by all kinds of other things. But there's some groups out of it, some disadvantaged groups, the legal profession as such, and in many ways, the ADR profession. We really don't have enough discussion and consensus about it, which does concern me. Mark's really concerned with bias and stuff. What I'm concerned about is the consolidation of power in whoever controls the technology. And that in many ways is biased too, in sometimes. But on the other hand, I maybe we won't go there. What we will do is we will have fully integrated platforms. Right, at the moment, let's say we're doing Zoom, we might use Dropbox, we might do a document on Word and send it around by email, but we're going to have all that integrated. And there's some of those platforms around now. We're also starting to see the use of technology in practice management in ADR, which is quite different. I've just signed up to do that because I think it will make a difference in particularly conveying information in a timely way to your clients. So what the future looks like with crystal balls. I mean, I wish to God I'd bought stock in Zoom 5 years before it became, everything to everyone.
Yeah. Well, speaking of this piece of the conversation, and the conversation, will continue and must continue, your book will be a big part of that, which is exciting, and bringing more people into the conversation by putting this information out there. So that's really exciting. Congratulations on
Thank
this.
you.
The first book on ODR out of Canada. So great. Is there anything else you want to share as we wrap up?
No, I think I've talked too much. Let Mark share some more.
Last piece for me is one thing I like to share as one of my pet peeves related to the in person on a pedestal is this sentiment that you sometimes hear of, why don't you just pick up the phone? There is a bias among some that traditional ways of communication are some way better. But there's a lot of research out there that shows us that particularly younger generations actually have a greater comfort with text-based communication. In fact, there were some studies done that showed that even compared to email, text was considered to be more personal. While it was less characters, it was the nature of the exchange in terms of the time and that sort of stuff that made it feel more authentic and more real. I know some people who don't like the traditional way of ordering a pizza. They're uncomfortable talking on the phone with a stranger. They're uncomfortable meeting a stranger in their doorway. They much prefer the way that the Ninja Turtles have always ordered pizza and the way we can today as we monitor things through the food apps and the like. The whole idea with mediation has always been to be flexible, to cater to the comfort level of the parties. Instead of forcing them into an unfamiliar territory, what we're able to do with online technologies is leverage where they're already comfortable. If you have somebody who's already comfortable participating in a Zoom call, because as Colm's client did, that's how they spoke with their grandkids, or somebody who prefers text-based exchanges because it gives them a chance to prepare drafts they don't always want to present live. It's hard for some people. We can utilize these technologies to allow them to participate in mediation in a more comfortable way. And in my experience, when parties are comfortable in mediation, that's when they're best positioned to make the most out of the mediation opportunity. So that's where I think there's a lot of potential here going forward.
I love that. I love that about, yeah, where people are at, what makes them comfortable. And then that's part of that thing that Colin was speaking to as well, of just, this is your design. You can really design the process now in a new way for the people that you're doing this for, which is amazing. Yeah.
Thanks so
Okay.
much. Thank you so much for
Thank you so much for doing it. It was a lot of fun to work with Marc to put it together.
Okay. Yeah, I
You know,
bet.
it really was.
You let me sneak in my Taylor Swift references. I think I have 3 in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He definitely was such a fan of the many references and all the different levels. Yeah, Taylor Swift, but then also Marshall McLuhan. I was like, this is a great range.
Something for everybody.
Yeah.
We